Okay, so I'm going to start off by reading one of Sangharakshita's poems. I'm not a big fan of Sangharakshita's poems, generally speaking. In fact, it was a bit of a running joke between Sangharakshita and I that I was not that keen on his poetry. I once travelled with him for a couple of months in America, the USA, and he did these poetry readings, and he would say to me in the car as we were travelling somewhere, and he was going to be giving a talk to another Sangha, and he'd say, I think I'll give another poetry reading. And then he'd kind of look at me and say, I hope that's all right. And I'd kind of go, oh God. But anyway, it was fascinating because he didn't just read the poems, he gave a whole kind of background to why he'd written something and what it meant to him. So in actual fact, I did become quite fond of many of his poems. And this is one that I do quite like. So I'm going to share an image on the screen. I think I'm allowed to do that. Yeah, I can just share an image. And I'm going to read the poem that goes with the image. So the image is of what's known as the wind horse. So interestingly, having Rijamati here, who used to work at Windhorse for many years. But and in fact, I did once give a talk based on this poem at Windhorse, but I suspect Rijamati wasn't there at the time. Anyway, so this is a poem called The Wind Horse. I am the wind horse. I am the king of space, the master of infinity, traversing the universe with flashing fiery hooves. On my strong back, on a saddle blazing with gems, I bear through the world the three flaming jewels. Once long ago, my galloping hooves were upheld by the delicate hands of gods as I bore through the night from home to homelessness, a young prince of the Shakya clan. I am the wind horse. White like a shooting star, I appear in the midst of the darkness of the world. Sometimes I trot, sometimes gallop, sometimes stand stock still in the midst of the heavens, so that all can see me in my glory. My loud neigh as I paw the clouds echo and re-echo throughout the universe, waking those who sleep, putting to flight the hosts of indolence, apathy, and despair. Hearing the sound of my voice, heroes regain their courage. I am the wind horse. I am thought at its clearest, emotion at its noblest, energy at its most abundant. I am friendliness, I am joy. I, only among beings, am pure enough, strong enough, swift enough to bear on my back the three flaming jewels. With what joy I sweep through the air, bearing age after age my thrice precious burden. With what joy, with what ecstasy I fulfill the greatest of all destinies. Plunging or soaring, I leave behind me a rainbow track. So that's the poem. It describes this figure that you can see on the screen. She's a beautiful horse, which represents energy and is carrying the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha right through the world, absolutely everywhere to wherever it's needed. So that's the image of the wind horse. And for me, that's an image of Virya. So what I'm going to do is unpick some of the lines of that poem and just kind of talk a little bit about it. I am thought at its clearest, emotion at its noblest, energy at its most abundant. So what we have here are, in a way, the three faculties that make up the human being: our thought or cognitive faculty, our feeling, emotional faculty, and the volition, the energy. And volition in this sense is virya. Energy in pursuit of the good, as Vanarajji told us before. There are lots of different translations of the term virya. The one that I actually really like and relate to is how Subhuti translates it in his book, Mind in Harmony. So Subhuti, if you don't know him, he's a very senior order member, been ordained for a very long time. And he's written quite a few books. One of them is a book called Mind in Harmony. And it's a kind of commentary on Sangharakshita's commentary on the 51 mental events, which is a teaching from the Abhidharma. Anyway, you don't need to know all that. That's just context. But in this book, when Subhuti talks about virya, he translates it as ardor. And I quite like the term ardor. It's kind of related to being on fire. And I like that sense. There's a passion to it. So I'm just going to read a couple of little quotes from Subhuti's book where he's talking about virya. Ardor begins to appear when faith is strong enough to produce effective spiritual practice. When faith is strong enough to produce effective spiritual practice. The strength of ardor, therefore, depends upon the strength of faith. However, ardor is not just a question of having strong feelings of faith, but also having the kind of maturity that can nurture and channel faith effectively and steer clear of any conditions that might dissipate it. The natural activity of ardor is to turn the mind towards wholesome states. So what we're hearing there is that in kind of independence upon our faith, we've come in relationship to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. We're deeply moved by them, perhaps, not only in an emotional sense, but cognitively we've thought, yeah, this makes sense. That was my experience. In a way, the Dharma came to me first. And then the Buddha came to me because obviously you didn't get the Dharma without the Buddha. And actually Sangha, I kind of liked, but I don't think I really understood its place in that kind of triangle. And what really got me involved and kind of passionate really about coming into relationship with our community was the way Sangharakshita in particular explained the Dharma. So we have faith in the Dharma, but we act in accordance with that faith. And that, according to this particular scheme of mental events, positive mental events, is where our energy and our virya and our ardor come from. So it rises in dependence upon our faith and the strength of our faith. And it's quite interesting that what it means is that we can channel that faith. So it isn't just something that we feel, but it's got volition. It's what moves us to act in particular ways. And, to turn the mind towards wholesome states. Later on in that book, Subhuti talks about virya as the mental force that seeks out the skillful or the more skillful and abandons the unskillful or the less skillful. So what that's saying, as I understand it, is that virya is discernment. So it's not just energy kind of, doing whatever. That's why it's in pursuit of the good. There's a discernment quality to it. This is something that I personally have had to learn through the years. Is, it's not enough just to have a lot of energy. It kind of depends what you do with it. So there's a channeling to virya. It's focused, it's clear. It's like a clean, clear energy that's able to move through us, as it were, to metaphorically speaking, and gives us a volition to act in ways that are in accordance with the faith that we've found, that are in accordance with our understanding of the Dharma. So as also Banaraji says, it's one of the 5 spiritual faculties. And the 5 spiritual faculties are an interesting kind of grouping. Buddhism loves lists. Buddhism loves to give you the 4 this and the 5 that and the 6 this and the 7 that. And some people love that. I actually quite like it. I'm just about kind of OCD enough to quite like having lists. It gives me something to kind of get a hold of. Some people hate them, and you don't have to be able to remember them. You don't need to remember exactly where everything comes. I like the patterns and the schemes myself. But, you know, as long as you have the sense that 5 spiritual faculties are these faculties that we hold in relationship to each other, and we try to hold them in balance and kind of know what they are. You don't really need to know where they come from, etc., etc. Anyway, I'm going to read you, having said all that, I'm going to read you a quote from Konza, who's a great commentator on Buddhism, or was a great commentator on Buddhism. And he talks about, can't remember exactly which work this comes from, but he talks about the 5 spiritual faculties. So again, just to give the overall pattern before I delve a bit more into my understanding of Virya. He says all the 5 virtues must be regarded as one whole. Their balance and harmony is almost as important as the virtues themselves. The one must sometimes be used to correct the excesses of the other. In this way, concentration, samadhi, must come to the rescue of vigor. When vigor and energy have it all their own way, tranquility is in danger. I love that. When vigor and energy have it all their own way, tranquility is in danger. We all know people, this is still Konza, we all know people with a large dash of adrenaline in their blood, always busy, always efficient, but not particularly restful to be around. Vigor by itself can lead to overexcitement and therefore needs to be balanced by the development of concentrated calm. So this is Dr. Konza's quote, and actually it's something that Sangharakshita, that Bhante has really emphasized as well. He uses the 5 spiritual faculties and he talks about the need for balance in them. And my own journey is one where he constantly reminded me that Virya is not just energy. He told me this on a number of occasions. And Virya needs to be sustainable. It therefore needs perseverance in a sense, which means that it's aligned with concentration, samadhi, tranquility, because therefore you have this sense of our actions can arise from a still center rather than just energy kind of going all over the place. And in the Visuddhimagga, another text, part of the canon, there's a little quote which I really like as well. It says, if there's too much concentration, too little vigor, the mind may be overpowered by indolence, to which concentration inclines. But if vigor is too strong and concentration too weak, the mind could be overpowered by agitation, to which vigor inclines. But concentration coupled with vigor will never lapse into indolence, and vigor coupled with concentration will not lapse into agitation. So there you go. So many years ago, before I was ordained, actually, I thought I should have been ordained. This is often the case, that people think they should be ordained before their preceptors or their, in my case, my teacher, Sangharakshita. I thought I was ready to be ordained. And, you know, when I got ordained in 1980, there was very little preparation. I think I had a weekend retreat looking at the 10 precepts that I was going to take. I mean, there was other preparation, obviously, but there wasn't a whole systematic preparation. And in the January of the year that I was ordained, I went on a retreat where I thought I might have been ordained. And it was a retreat that Padmashuri and Ashoka Shri were ordained on, and myself and somebody else thought we were getting ordained. And just before the retreat began, my friend Amadina took me aside and said, you know, Banti doesn't think he's going to ordain you in this retreat. That was, you know, he didn't get a letter or anything. And I was really cross. I thought, why on earth no? You know, I'm obviously ready. What's the matter with this man? So, so, you know, it was on a seminar, a study seminar actually. And Banti was seeing people in the evening, you know, he'd go along and have a cup of tea with him after dinner. So I asked if I could meet up with him, and I marched off to see him. And he'd been having his dinner with us, and then he went off. And this was at Padmaloka, where at least some of the guys, I imagine, will know Padmaloka. But it was very different in 1980. The community was separated from the retreat centre by a swing door. And anyway, I was going through to the community to see Banti, and I kind of marched through because I was like gonna, you know, wanted to sort out why I wasn't being ordained. So embarrassing to think about it. Anyway, I was young. So I marched off and I threw open this swing door without realizing that he was actually standing at the other side of it with his cup of tea. So anybody that met Banti or went to see him or saw him, whatever, would know that he was very strong on mindfulness. So he stood there with his cup of tea and he kind of had to jump back because I almost knocked him down by the force of me coming through this door. And he kind of looked at me and I just felt like, oh God, I'll just crawl back under the door. So I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm coming to see you. And he kind of looked at his watch and said, well, just give me 5 minutes to settle. So I kind of went into his study 5 minutes later and sat down, and he said, did you want to talk to me about anything in particular? Which was outrageous because he knew fine what I wanted to talk to him about. So I said, well, Banti, I just would like to know why I'm not being ordained. And he kind of looked at me and he went, and how is your mindfulness practice? Having just about knocked him down, I had to confess that mindfulness was not really my strong point. So he said to me, and I can quite remember this, I was sitting there feeling very humbled, and he said, you know that Virya is not the only spiritual faculty that needs developed. So that was my first teaching about Virya. That was in 1980. And his advice to me was to do the mindfulness of breathing a lot. So I did. Anyway, I mean, he used to talk a lot about energy, and he used to sort of tease myself and some others from Scotland because he had this thing that the Scots tended to have quite a lot of energy. And he once said every centre could use 1 or 2 Scots, but they're like salt. You don't need very many to actually give a bit of flavour. So I feel like my whole journey in a way has been one of actually learning what Virya actually is and how to work with a kind of excess of a certain kind of energy and not enough of the kind of samadhi tranquility that balances it. That's why I had a wee smile and a wee snort when Vaniraji said that she thought my energy was very balanced and came from a place of tranquility. So maybe after 40 odd years, something's changed. That's good. Anyway, what I'd like to say about that is that in a way, there is kind of no spiritual life without Virya. Because we need volition, we need to move, we need to act. And we need to do that from a basis of energy that's in pursuit of the good, energy that is dedicated towards putting our faith into action. But what all of that was about as well is that it's important that it's well channeled. And Virya is not always loud. And that's again something that I think I've had to learn. Being quite an extrovert, I think I've had to learn as well that Virya can be very paced, very quiet, and even not that obvious. And we probably all know people like that are really quite quiet, and, you know, they don't take up a lot of space, but you realize that they've just carried on and on and on for a very, you know, for years, just kind of actually doing what's needing to be done, doing the next thing without a lot of fanfare. So to go back to the poem, there's a little bit in it that says, sometimes I trot, sometimes gallop, sometimes stand stock still in the midst of the heavens. So the wind horse, Virya, will sometimes be stock still. And this is important to learn. It's important to know when to pause, when to take a rest, when to take stock of our actions. So that made me think of this idea of near enemies. So you sometimes find this, you might have come across this, particularly when we talk about the Brahma Viharas, when we talk about metta, for example, that has an enemy. In a way, the enemy of metta is cruelty or hatred, but there's a near enemy to metta, which is a kind of sentimental liking of things, pema. And in the same way, I think there are near enemies to virya, to this energy in pursuit of the good. And the ones that came to my mind thinking about it were intoxication. You know, when something is so exciting and we get really intoxicated and really high, and it might be that there's virya within that, but it also can be more frothy. You know, it can sometimes be a little bit on the surface. And also I thought enthusiasm. Now, enthusiasm, I think, is really great, and it's fabulous to have enthusiasm, but it's not the same as, for example, inspiration. We can be inspired, but not particularly enthusiastic, I think. And we can be enthusiastic without much inspiration. I don't know if that's obvious or if I need to say any more about that, but I know that sometimes I hear people being really enthusiastic about something, but actually you can kind of tell that it doesn't have a spring below it. You know, it's not fed. And I've, you know, felt this myself at times. I've got enthusiastic about something, but it's not fed by a spring of inspiration. So therefore it's harder to kind of keep it going. It's harder to have continuity. And sometimes I've felt very inspired by something, but I've not been that enthusiastic about actions that might be in relationship to that. So for example, I'm very, very inspired by the idea of the Bodhisattva, which was mentioned, which is the idea that my practice is not purely for me, but that when I practice, I'm practicing to help create conditions to alleviate the suffering of others, which, you know, in many ways comes around through helping others to see the truth of things, see the reality of things. So that inspires me greatly. But, you know, sometimes, I can't quite think of an example of it, but there might be things I don't feel that enthusiastic about doing, but because I have that sense of inspiration, that sense of a belief in that, I'll do them anyway, if that makes sense, even though at that moment I don't feel particularly enthusiastic. But because I feel that it is in line with the kind of volition of my life, then if I possibly can, then I'll do it, even if I don't feel like yippee about it. Okay, so that's kind of near enemies, as it were. But there's also far enemies. There's also things that are almost like the opposite of virya. So going back to the poem, it says, my loud neighings as I paw the clouds echo and re-echo throughout the universe, waking those who sleep, putting to flight the hosts of indolence, apathy, and despair. So indolence, apathy, and despair are the kind of enemies of virya. They sap our energy. They kind of drain our energy. And in another work, the Bodhicharya Avatara, Shantideva, which is a fantastically poetic and philosophical work, which is called the Bodhicharya Avatara, means the guide to the way of the Bodhisattva. So it's very much in line with this idea that we practice not just for ourselves, but for others. And that work looks at Virya not as one of these 5 spiritual faculties, but as part of another list, another grouping called the Paramitas or the Paramis. There are 10 Paramis. Usually we know of 6, but there are some others. And in the chapter on Virya, Shantideva says, what is the antithesis of Virya? Sloth, clinging to what is vile, despondency, and self-contempt. So I think that's really interesting little list. I mean, in a way, sloth is kind of obvious, if we're really kind of, he goes on to say sloth is like indulging in pleasures that make us sleep. So indulging in things that drain our energy or that kind of, sap away our energy, leave you almost a bit drunk afterwards. And maybe that's the other side of the intoxication, because I know certainly if I'm intoxicated, then there's a bit of a slump can come afterwards. Clinging to what is vile, well, I guess what that means is using our energy in pursuit of the things that are not in line with our practice, not in line with our ideals, not in line with our values. And I don't think I need to give examples of that. We probably all know things that we can get caught up in. But then I think the other one, like despondency and self-contempt, I think they're an interesting little pair, really, to think about how they drain our energy. The kind of the idea that that self-despair and despondency is a drain on our energy in pursuit of the good. Because I think sometimes, we can feel that sense at times of I'm just not good enough or I'm just not up to this. And I had a little personal mantra many years ago. In fact, it was about becoming a public preceptor, which I do not think means that we're in charge of everything, by the way. I'll just say that. It basically means that we help run the ordination processes and, have quite a lot to say about who gets ordained and when and how, in communication with all sorts of other people. But when I became a public preceptor, I remember just thinking, oh man, I'm not going to swear because we're in a nice Buddhist group, but I did probably swear at the time and think, what? No way, Jose. And then my little mantra was, I'm not up to it, but I'm up for it. And I kind of just decided I would use that. And I've used it as a mantra on a lot of occasions. When I've been asked to do something that actually I don't really feel that I've quite got what it needs. And I've thought, well, I don't feel up to this, but actually there's nobody else to do it. Or there are particular reasons why I'm being asked to do it. For example, one of the reasons I think I was asked to be a public preceptor was because I spoke Spanish fairly fluently. So I could work with people in that Spanish speaking world. And there were a lot of women who'd asked for ordination and there wasn't a public preceptor at that point who spoke Spanish. So I kind of thought, well, okay, circumstances have taken me into this. So I'm not up to it, but I will be up for it. So for me, that's a way of kind of working with that sense of not being quite good enough. So how do we fight apathy, indolence and despair? I guess that's the question. I'm kind of running out of time, but I will try and finish fairly promptly. I just want to mention, another list, which is the four efforts, the 4 right efforts, because I think they're really important in terms of thinking about our energy and how we work with our energy. So the 4 right efforts are to prevent the arising of negative mental states that have not yet arisen, the eradication of negative mental states that have already arisen, the cultivation of positive mental states that have not yet arisen, and the maintenance, if you like, of those positive mental states that have already arisen. And I relate that very strongly to Virya because in a way, our mental states our emotional states, how we are in relation to, our energy, whatever, it is very much it will very much affect our volition, if that makes sense. Our emotional states and our mental states will affect how we act in the world. So I find this list really quite practical. Just the prevention, catching them as they arise. For me, the main negative mental event that I work with continuously is anger. I'm more inclined to the grump and the kind of irritability end of the spectrum than the gimme, gimme, gimme end of the spectrum, although they're not always that far apart. So like coming to a point where I can recognize very clearly when I'm about to get cross or angry. And I know the kind of conditions that will drive me into that. I know the kind of party political broadcasts not to watch. I know the kind of things not to read or listen to, because I know that they're going to drive me mad and I'm going to get into a particular mental state. So I can prevent that by being careful about where I put, the doors of the senses, as they say. And then there's other work to do with eradicating those mental states when they have arisen. And, like anger in itself arises depending on what you do with it. It's not necessarily bad woo-woo, it's kind of what happens sometimes in relationship to things, any negative mental state. But we're learning ways to work with that, whether it's through meditation, through looking at what the underlying source of that reactivity is, etc. So that's prevention and eradicating. And then, cultivating, well, we all know how to cultivate positive mental states, meditation, learning more. I think learning a lot more about the Dharma. I think Dharma study can be really helpful, because if we understand the true nature of existence, then in a way our relationship with conditioned existence changes. We don't fight it and try and make it be what we'd like it to be. We don't push away what threatens us, and we don't cling to what we think might build up our identity. If we can live in harmony with the arising and the passing of phenomena, then in a way we can cultivate those positive mental states in relationship to whatever life throws us and the maintenance of that. I had a little thought actually last year, because, the pandemic and the virus and all that. I was thinking about the whole thing about eradication. And, because there was talk last year about, can we eradicate COVID-19? So it was before we started getting new strains of it, but in the summer last year, and I started thinking, what's the difference between eradication and elimination? So I did a bit of research on this. An eradication of a virus, of an illness, and most of you probably know this, I'm late to the party sometimes, but eradication of it means to bring it down to very manageable levels, preferably zero, but certainly low enough to be manageable. Whereas elimination means worldwide, you have actually completely got rid of this virus. Polio was more or less eliminated. I think there've been some outbreaks of it. Smallpox is more or less eliminated. But COVID-19, the best we can look for at the moment would seem to be eradication. Anyway, I thought it's the same with your negative mental states, really, isn't it? Can we really expect complete elimination of greed, hatred, and delusion? Given that we're human, given that we have a body and senses and an ego and a sense of self that gets threatened, etc. Can we totally eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion? And the conclusion I came to was the best I could hope for was eradication, really trying to bring it down. But the thing about a virus, when it isn't eliminated, is it can arise again. You can get new strains of it. And unfortunately, I have come to the conclusion this is also true of my negative mental states. There are new strains that creep their way in. And there's also a world out there where greed, hatred, and delusion has not been eliminated, and probably not even eradicated or half eradicated. So however much I'm working on my own mental states, I'm constantly being faced with things that challenge me. So anyway, I have no idea if that's helpful, but I found it quite helpful just to think the best I can do is eradicate and continue to do that and be, on the lookout for new strains. Okay, so just trying to kind of start moving towards conclusion. Sloth, I want to pick up a little bit again on sloth, because one of the things I've come to the conclusion, and this is related perhaps to things I've said before, is that I think we can get slothful when we're not disillusioned enough. So what I mean by that is quite often we come along to the Dharma, whether that's coming to Triratna or whether it's finding the Dharma in other contexts, which, these days there's so many ways to come in touch with the Dharma. We read something about Buddhism. We kind of see through samsara, as it were. We recognize that samsara is not giving us what we need. And maybe we're actually suffering through heartbreak, maybe a relationship's ended, we've lost something, we've lost somebody, there's been a bereavement, or we're just kind of unsatisfied with things aren't going that well. And I've seen this again and again, and somebody comes along quite, quite angst-ridden. They find the Dharma, they find meditation, they start to practice, life gets better, and that's it somewhere. But that isn't what the Dharma is about. It's not just to make us feel better and kind of, that's great. Obviously it's good to kind of find a way to actually exist in the world more happily, more content, with more contentment. But we forget the disillusionment that drove us in initially. So I think one of the things about Virya is that it reminds us to remember what it was that drove us to the Dharma in the first place. So I think that's another side of Virya, that continuity of purpose, to remind us that cyclic existence will never fulfill us in any existential sense. So Virya, that's an aspect of Virya, is to recollect and remember that, which is why it's quite connected, I think, with mindfulness. That sense of recollecting and remembering. So don't settle into the good conditions that you've found. Use the good conditions as a launch pad for the rocket of your spiritual practice. Remind ourselves to remember. Anyway, it doesn't mean we don't enjoy life. It doesn't mean that there isn't joy to be found. It's not like we have to kind of keep our energy very, going like that. In the poem, it says, I am friendliness, I am joy. With what joy I sweep through the air, bearing age after age my thrice precious burden. So there's joy in that. The energy, we keep it alive, we find joy, we find ways of, whether that's friendship, whether it's through a meditation practice, whether it's a walk in the countryside, whatever it is that feeds us and keeps our Virya alive is really important. And one other wee list before I finish is a list that Bhante has given about things that drain our energy. And I'm not going to go into detail, I'll just tell you what they are. And they come from a talk on the Sevenfold Puja, if I remember correctly. And he gives a list of the things that drain our energy. Grumbling, carping criticism, cynicism, something called dismal Jimmyism, which apparently was something that came from the Second World War, when they talked about being a dismal Jimmy when you couldn't keep, keep your chin up, or whatever the expression is. Gossip, he says, drains our energy. And the last one was nagging. So that's the list for you. He says quite a bit more about them in that lecture if you want to hear. So how do we keep our Virya alive? Well, one of the things that I think is also helpful is to support each other. I think spiritual friendship is a real support to our Virya, because you can go up and down, can't you, with your energy, with your inspiration, with your care, with your love. They all go up and down. If you're part of a Sangha and a community, then hopefully you don't all go down at the same time. So it's important that we're able to help each other to kind of keep our Virya alive. And one of those things is also to be able to recognize that we need to pace ourselves and help each other to do that. And this is something that I'm actually learning at the moment, because recently my health hasn't been great. And I have found myself with considerably less energy than I'm used to. And, friends are telling me, you need to sort of cut back a bit, or you need to think about what this is about. I think it's partly because my B12 was very low and my iron was apparently dangerously low. So I'm kind of working with that. But the experience has been really weird because I have this, I'm used to being able to kind of respond to things, and I'm having to kind of look at that. So it's important that we help each other, I think, with that we actually help bring tranquility and virya into each other's lives as well as into our own. Projects, things that we work on together. I mean, I know you've got a great project going at the moment in MEBC, which is your fundraiser and your new centre. My God, you're all going to need plenty of virya for that. So again, to help each other, I think is really important. And the poem says, hearing the sound of my voice, heroes regain their courage. How great is that? So we can help each other with virya to keep our courage faced with things like, my God, are we actually going to raise this money? How long is it going to take? Are we all bonkers and try to do this? So that's going to need virya, and it's going to need to support each other. And, I think part of that courage is the courage to act with the belief that our actions are good without necessarily knowing the outcome. And I think that's something that that's part for me of the ideal of a bodhisattva, the bodhisattva ideal, that idea of working for the good of all beings. We don't really know what that means or what it's going to look like or what the end point is. But the important thing is that that's my motivation. That's our motivation. That's the volition, is to act in ways that will alleviate suffering, our own and others, so that we can say with the wind horse, with what joy, with what ecstasy, I fulfill the greatest of all destinies. Plunging or soaring, I leave behind me a rainbow track. Thank you.